The rain poured relentlessly as Melania Trump's motorcade pulled up to an unassuming brick building on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. This wasn't a political event. There were no cameras, no reporters, just a dimly lit shelter tucked away. From the city's polished avenues, her security detail moved to open the car door. But Melania paused, staring out the window. The shelter's sign was faded, the entrance barely lit by a flickering bulb. A stark contrast to the world she was used to. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. With a quiet nod, she stepped out, a simple beige coat wrapped tightly around her. No extravagant entourage, no grand announcement, just a woman walking into the unknown. Inside, the air was thick with quiet conversations, the scent of instant coffee lingering in the background. Women and children sat huddled together, some avoiding eye contact, others too exhausted to care. A shelter worker, startled by her unexpected presence, rushed over. "Mrs. Trump, we didn't know you were coming." Melania gave a small smile. "I wanted to see for myself," she said softly. "No press, no distractions." A young girl no older than 10 peeked out from behind her mother, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. Her wide, fearful eyes met Melania's, and in that instant, the First Lady felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a visit. This was about to become a moment that would change everything. The shelter worker hesitated for a moment, then motioned for Melania to follow. The hallway was lined with bunk beds, some with small backpacks at the foot, the only belongings these families had left. The walls, though freshly painted, couldn't hide the exhaustion etched into the faces of the women sitting together, their voices hushed as they comforted their children. Melania walked slowly, her heels barely making a sound against the linoleum floor. A woman in her late 30s sat near the doorway, her arms wrapped protectively around a young boy. He was no older than 6, but his eyes were hollow, his small fingers clutching the sleeve of his mother's sweater as if afraid to let go. Melania knelt beside them. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The boy hesitated, glancing up at his mother. "It's okay," the woman whispered. "Go ahead." The boy looked back at Melania, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jacob." Melania offered him a warm smile. "That's a strong name." Jacob said nothing. Instead, his gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders tightening. His mother exhaled shakily. "We came here 2 weeks ago. I had nowhere else to go." She swallowed hard, clearly fighting back tears. No one tells you how fast things can fall apart. One moment, you have a home, a job, stability, and then you don't. Melania listened, her expression unreadable but her eyes filled with something deeper, understanding. She turned to the shelter worker. "What do they need most?" The worker sighed. "More than anything? Stability? Resources? A chance." Melania looked around, taking in the harsh reality of their situation. Then, standing tall, she made a decision. That's about to change. A quiet determination settled in Melania's expression. She wasn't here to make empty promises. She was here to do something. She turned back to the shelter worker. "How many families are here?" 36, the worker responded. "Most of them mothers with children." Melania nodded. "And how many more could you take in if you had the resources?" The worker hesitated, then sighed. "At least twice as many. We turn people away every week because we just don't have the space or funding." Melania's gaze swept across the room. Women comforting their children. Kids trying to play, pretending things were normal. A place that was doing its best, but barely holding on. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her phone. "Who are you calling?" the worker asked cautiously. "My team," Melania replied. "I want a full report on what it takes to expand this shelter. Funding, resources, everything." The worker's eyes widened. "Mrs. Trump, with all due respect, shelters like ours get overlooked all the time. We apply for grants, we hold fundraisers, and—" Melania met her gaze firmly. "Not anymore." The shelter fell into silence. Even the exhausted mothers looked up, sensing something different about this moment. She turned to Jacob's mother, her voice softer now. "You said, no one tells you how fast things can fall apart." She exhaled. "But no one tells you how fast they can be rebuilt either." Jacob's small hand tugged at his mother's sleeve again, this time with a little more hope in his eyes. And Melania? She had just set something in motion that no one saw coming. Within an hour, phone calls had been made. Within a day, meetings were being scheduled. Within a week, everything was changing. Melania Trump didn't just visit the shelter that day, she took action. A private donation, large enough to fund immediate improvements, was secured. But Melania didn't stop there. She worked behind the scenes, connecting the shelter with organizations that could provide long-term solutions, job training programs, education grants, family counseling, and then a press conference was announced, not because Melania wanted credit, but because the issue deserved attention. Standing before the cameras, she addressed the nation. "There are families in this country, mothers, children, who are struggling in ways we cannot ignore," she said. "We must do better, and we will." The Biden headlines the next day were unexpected. Melania Trump's visit sparks a movement to help America's forgotten families. A shelter was on the brink. Now it's expanding. One moment, one decision, and lives are changing. And back. At the shelter, Jacob and his mother had been moved to a transitional housing program. He had a bed of his own. She had a job interview lined up. Their nightmare wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. And Melania? She didn't ask for recognition. She simply left knowing that real change had begun. If you believe in the power of action over words, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. What's the biggest act of kindness you've ever witnessed?